Right. So I'm here with Jed and Craig again, and we're gonna, I guess, just talk about stuff. We got a few things on the agenda, but I think we're gonna start off. Jed, you were saying that you had some other thoughts on garments going off our last
Yes.
conversation. So,
Yeah, I was thinking about it in the context of the series that Nate Heil and I are doing on Revelation, right? And one of the images that comes through in Revelation is that the people entering the kingdom are those who have had their garments washed clean by the blood of the Lamb, right? Um, and it connected to something I had read in here. I'll go ahead and pull the book here. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Margaret Barker, but this book here is called Temple Mysticism. Margaret Barker is kind of a very interesting independent scholar in Great Britain that writes mostly on like the theology surrounding the temple and the temple mysticism. She's done some work in uh, the Apocalypse of John as well, but she's mostly the Old Testament scholar and the intertestamental, you know, Judaism, early Christianity, kind of that's where her studies lead her. But one of the things she had pulled out, and I didn't even think about it until a little bit earlier this afternoon, was that Adam and Eve, and this is a fairly common motif, is that when they found themselves naked after eating the fruit, it's because they had lost their garments of light, right? So they had lost their garments, and kind of in the apocalyptic Judaism prior to Christianity, there was a sense where the image of God was not destroyed when Adam and Eve fell, right? But that they did lose the glory, right? So they lost their glory, but the image remained. And so the that image then that we were talking about in our previous conversation from Matthew 22 about you know the entrance into the kingdom as depicted in this wedding banquet. Everybody was invited, the multitudes respond, they come in, but one person gets kicked out because they're not wearing the proper garment, right? And so they get kicked out of the party. I was like, oh, I really think that like what that might be pointing to is kind of in that those apocalyptic or eschatological garments. The first glory that is like the second, that is the same as the second glory, and that they're clothed with that. They've been clothed, they've been washed clean by the blood of the Lamb. I apologize. Let me go ahead and put that on. So they've been washed clean by the blood of the Lamb. So they're re-robed in the glory of God. And I think like what you get a sense of is that both in Eden and in the New Jerusalem, and then I think in this parable in Matthew 22, are talking about the matching between the internal and the external state, right? So whatever is on the outside is reflective then of what is on the inside. And that is a kind of a marker of restoration and renewal, like the inner and the outer man had been renewed, kind of thing. And so I think that there was a connection there. I was just curious what you guys thought of that.
I actually have a lot of thoughts on this sort of. Uh, I get kind of weird on it too, but so there's
And I'm eating right now too. I apologize. I'm eating my snack here, so I'll be listening and I'll be popping off camera just so that people don't have to see
you
me
should make sure you keep that
frowned out.
unmuted so we can hear the mouth noises. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Um, yeah, actually, it was after our talk too that I was reading through John in the Gospel of John, and it says, "For everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth and comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen that they've been done in God." And so what I was saying to Mitch was, I was like, there's just this level of exposure and like vulnerability and nakedness, kind of like we were talking about. And it's like even if your deeds were bad, when you come to God in like repentance, seeking forgiveness, it's like you're willingly approaching the light, exposing yourself in a way that you'll be clothed in light, trusting that the light will clothe you. So there's a verse in Job where he says, when a man does wrong, like he should turn, basically saying something like he should turn to his fellow neighbors and brothers and say, I've sinned and I've done wrong and it did not profit me. So there's a way kind of like if you're actively, willingly engaging in bad deeds, you want to clothe yourself in darkness. But when, even if your past deeds were bad and you're seeking repentance and forgiveness, it's like even those you're willing to expose. And it's like this, uh, you're you're coming naked so that way you can be clothed in light in a way. And so so I thought that was kind of interesting. I think it goes exactly with what you're saying. In the I don't know, there's just stuff throughout the scriptures where it seems like that's kind of what it's getting at, clothing yourself in light. Like when Jesus goes up on the mountain transfiguration and his clothing is white, um, basically he looks like an angel. Like the priests, if you read the priest garments that when God gives them to the priests in Exodus, it's very similar to angels, like the fine linen. So it would reflect back white and everything and all that.
Oh man, you've got to read Barker.
Yeah. And it's just it's really interesting because you were even mentioning like the new temple and everything. And what my mind always goes to is I can read these parts from Ezekiel because it's talking about the new temple. And for some reason, like there's certain things in the Bible where like I read them, and for some reason I'll read things historically, and then certain things like I don't know, my mind will just shift, and I like will never. It's like I all of a sudden read it like metaphysically or something, or I don't know how you say it spiritually. But this part, it just reminded me of it reminds me of the garden too after the fall, but I can say why. And it's first Ezekiel 44 verse 17, and it shall be whenever they enter the gates of the inner court that they shall put on linen garments. No wool shall come upon them while they minister within the gates of the inner court or within the house. They shall have linen turbans on their heads and linen trousers on their bodies. They shall not clothe themselves with anything that causes sweat. When they go out to the outer court of the people, they shall take off their garments in which they ministered, leave them in the holy chambers, and put on other garments. And in their holy garments they shall not sanctify the people. And then let's see. There was another part too where it kind of, I think it repeats one of the same words. Or maybe I passed over it. Um, oh yeah. But there they shall leave their garments in which they minister, for they are holy. They shall put on other garments, then they may approach that which is for the people. So you kind of just this image. The reason it reminds me of the garden, because after the fall, God says, "In the sweat of your brow, you're going to toil." And so he's saying there, like, you shouldn't clothe yourself with anything that causes sweat. And for some reason, when I read that passage, it just reminds me of the weird, like, entertaining angels part in Hebrews, where it's uh, like you have these heavenly beings that can appear in the form of men or something. Like they're almost taking a different form. But when they're in their heavenly form, they're clothed in light and they don't actually, and then when they come to, yeah, this is where I said it gets kind of weird. This is probably just my weird, like strange thoughts on it. But if you were to meet an angelic being in this life, they would probably just look like a person because they're clothing themselves in that which causes sweat in order to uh, encounter the people or something like that. I don't know. Probably being too weird. But anyways,
No, I would be even weirder than that if you guys
okay.
want me to go there.
Yeah, let's hear it.
I think that there's like based on just some of the writings of especially Sergei Bulgakov, and as we're reading through like Revelation 4 and 5, I think there's a very strong argument to be made that angels and humans share a common nature.
I wanted to ask you about that with relation to Barker.
Mhm.
How would you describe the relationship between approaching the temple or approaching the inner parts of the temple with the shared aspects or the shared natures?
Right. That's a good. So maybe you've read Barker before, then, Craig. Are you
I
cheating?
know. No. I'm asking. I suspect you know a lot more about Barker than I do. It's not a trick question.
No, I know. I'm having fun. So what Barker brings out, based on both a really close reading of the especially Pentateuch, so the temple text or tabernacle texts in the Pentateuch, so Leviticus, then into the temple texts in First Kings and in Second Kings and in Chronicles, right? Temple is second, no, First Kings. Temple is in First Kings, right? When the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies, right, which is representative of day one of creation, where things exist in a primal unity, right, and that's where the angels exist as well, but that you're going beyond the veil, right? Well, in order to go beyond the veil, it required death, right? Which is why the sacrificial animals, had to be slaughtered before the high priest could enter in. And he takes off his wool, the wool portions of his garment, the ones that are woven with the same material as the veil of the Holy of Holies is his outer vestment. He has to go down to his inner vestment, which is the linen, right? And so he is sacramentally dead as he passes through the veil, right? And when the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies, the high priest becomes an angel of the Lord.
Elaborate. You said he's sacramentally dead when he enters through the veil.
Yeah, it's to no mortal can go into the inner presence of God, right? So you are in your immortal or angelic form when you're beyond the veil.
What do
Right?
you mean by sacramentally dead?
Well, because the priest, like physically, the priest has not actually died passing through the veil. Now, our high priest, Jesus, did die to pass through the veil. But to say sacramentally is just to say that the sacramental act of the sacrifice signifies the death of the priest, right? Before he enters into the Holy of Holies. And then he's also bringing the death of the people into the Holy of Holies as well. And that's being that the sins are, the atoning work is sanctifying from death and from unholiness of all kind, right? And this is really strongly attested in like the Enochic literature, where Enoch goes into the heavenly Holy of Holies, which is really cool if you've read some of those portions in Enoch. And he becomes an angel, right? He becomes the, what is it? Metatron is in some of the Enochic texts, which are later, but such a cool, it's definitely a metal name for sure.
Yeah.
But he becomes an angel, right? Even like the early Christians, without diminishing Christ's divinity, would call him the angel of our salvation, right? And that's because, not because they thought of him as like a lower God, but because he had fulfilled that priestly role and had gone into the Holy of Holies and taken on his angelic form. And so when the priest comes back out of back out from within the veil to outside of the veil, he is an angel of the Lord, a representative or a messenger of the Lord, there to impart teaching, instruction, and and then also to oversee worship, right? And so it kind of has like, that's the role of the priest. And so even in the even in like the Old Testament and intertestamental literature, there was a permeability between the humanity and the human and the angelic world, right? Or the visitors that Abraham has, his 3 visitors, right? They come to him in human form, right? So I think it reinforces the point that you're making, Jason. So when I'm saying like, I think the angels are human, I don't think I'm actually saying anything that the scriptures aren't actually saying. It's just that dimensionally they're different, right? From a different dimension than the seen realm that we are in, and not bound to mortality, at least not in the same way that we are. And so I may even tie into some of the other things you wanted to discuss, but no, that would mean that the angels are not immutable, that they're not beyond change. They're not even infallible. Like if we get into Paul, like Paul is very hard on the angelic powers in multiple places. So it doesn't seem like he's discriminating between good angels and bad angels. He's calling their competency and their management of the cosmos into question, and saying that Christ comes to set us free from the mismanagement of the archons, right? So at least a certain classification that we might call angels.
Yeah.
So
that's
in a way, like I would say, like you're looking at like an angelic divine humanity all the way up and all the way down to creation as a result of the incarnation. I know those are all really big statements, but I'd be willing to unpack them if necessary.
No, I'm tracking with you. It makes sense to me. I would I like the idea of the like an angel. I guess it's hard to think not too materialistically about it, but the idea of like an actual heavenly body or whatever, the angel actually coming in human form, because you hear stories about that where people be like, this person helped me fix my flat tire, then I turn around and he was gone. And it's like, and they have this sense that it was an angel or something. I'm like, those stories are cool. I like those too. But then there's also the other sense where just an actual person could be an angel. And I think there's like
Mhm.
there's it's good to be aware of that too, where like God could be speaking through somebody you talk to every day, and they could be coming like as in that way of using angel as just like a messenger from carrying a divine truth from the heavens or something within them. And so that could be, I mean, that could be your child even. That could be, yeah, just anybody you encounter on the earth too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think there's like, in certain mystical Christian schools, like, and you get into like maybe some of the anthroposophy, the Christian anthroposophy of like Rudolf Steiner, those concepts show up again in a little bit of a different pattern. Um, but I think that there's even some valid arguments to how that might connect to the concept of guardian angels. And
That's interesting.
like that we all in a sense have an angelic form as well, right?
Mm.
So in a sense, yes, every human is potentially, at least in some way, could actualize that angelic nature and become a messenger of God, which is what an angel actually is, right?
Jared,
Or
so what would you say if somebody was suspicious at this point in the conversation where they said, this sounds kind of new agey? How would you reinforce that claim that about the shared nature between humans and angels, or how would Barker do it?
Barker probably doesn't get too much into like the actual much into the metaphysics because she's more of an exegete of scripture, right? So you're not going to get like a strong argument there. But if I was to reduce it in a really simple way, I mean, there's very complicated ways to describe this, but I think it all relates to the incarnation, right? Is that the creator of and the binding reality in which all creation is, like Paul would put in what is that in Ephesians 1, I believe, that all creation is recapitulated in Christ, right? That he is the logos of all creation. That's a human being, right? And so a human person is responsible for all that is seen and unseen. And that is the lamb slain from before the foundation of the world. So it's not like you can abstract humanity away from Jesus in some sort of pre-incarnate state that's already, in some sense, present in Jesus always, right? And so I think that like when we're looking at the broad picture of when we're looking at the nature of what is a human and what is an angel and what is creation, well, like scientists have a funny way of calling that, just they call it the anthropic principle, right? Or fine tuning of the universe. It appears that it was made in such a way that is conducive to human beings. Well, why would that be? Well, maybe because we have a human creator, right? And so it seems to boggle the mind because we're not used to thinking in that way. But my argument would just simply be based on the fact that we worship an incarnate creator.
Mm.
And so creation, I believe, will at every level, top to bottom, bear the marks of that incarnation and bear the image of that incarnation. So he is microcosmically and macrocosmically, creation is his body, which he is to which he is to be wedded in nuptial bliss, right?
All right, I've been persuaded.
So there's tighter metaphysical things you could do to demonstrate that, but I think it's just like at the simple level, that's a pretty decent way to say like, hey, yeah, it does sound new agey and it's really weird, and I could get weirder, but backing up and saying like, no, that's where we that's where we come from. We come from a human creator, and I say that unblinkingly because I worship Jesus. You know?
Is there a
I
way
felt like
to?
we were,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
you go, Jason.
No,
No,
go.
you.
Okay. I was just wondering,
Hey,
is there a
so
way this makes, I mean, sense to me and I'm on board with it all. I'm just wondering if there's a way you could even describe what you're saying to like a skeptical atheist, or would you describe it the same way? Or
I mean,
would you?
I would expect like a really intelligent, skeptical atheist to just think it's total hogwash.
Okay.
But I think it doesn't mean that the argument itself is incoherent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, but in terms of the burden of proof, like I don't like getting into the proof side of that. I'm less concerned about
Yeah.
maybe just because that's not where my mind goes in terms of do I need to prove or disprove this? It's like, well, where does the spiritual or metaphysical logic kind of follow the thread, the causal and logical chain on
Yeah.
some of those things. And it seems like if the Christian claims are true, a claim that humans and angels share a common nature, finite created nature, that's what we hold in common. All right. They may have a different taxonomy or, different morphology, or, you can, as you're getting into, kind of the morphological classification of being, yeah, they can have some difference from us, but that's only because there's still a more prior fundamental unity.
Mhm.
I get that sometimes we're talking about kind of thematic aspects or interpretations that are viable, and sometimes you get the sense, man, this is a really, really viable, strong association. This one seems less so. It's a little looser to me.
Mhm.
I felt like we were really in a good neighborhood and a fruitful neighborhood when we were talking about the garments in relationship to the different layers of the
Mhm.
temple.
Mhm.
Something specific on my mind when we were talking about that was the shedding of the garments wasn't something that I had an appreciation for
Mhm.
before this conversation. But there's that you have this room where it's the room with the fire burning.
Mhm.
You know, something. I wonder what you guys make of this, because this is kind of and it's related to dying. You liken to Christ dying on the cross, or maybe you would have said that was the veil, but there's a correspondence, at least in my mind, to this middle room, to like this place of suffering, or this place of, you know, before the dying. What do you make of that?
It's a really good question. My mind was kind of going in a few different directions. Can you, yeah, I mean, maybe Jason, you could take a crack at it, or just kind of go
So
back
you're
over
saying
it.
this, you're saying the place before the holiest of holies is like a place of kind of like suffering in a sense. I don't know. The way I
Like
was like thinking of
in
it
the
too.
temple structure. So the best way I see what you're saying, and I think to put that into a temple structure, I'm not sure how that would map, but it could just be because I'm missing something too. But the temple structure kind of is holy of holies, holy place, then the outer sanctuary, right? And so the holy of holies kind of is a certain kind of holiness that is both intrinsically holy and can make other things holy, right? And you get out into the holy
Contagiously
place,
holy.
right? And then you get out into the holy place where the worship is really, for most part, the worship is happening within the inner and outer courts, right? And so kind of the correspondence, like if the inner sanctum of the temple is kind of corresponding to the spirit, the inner court would correspond to the soul, the outer court to the body, kind of thing, is that the outer courts are passively holy. That means they have to receive holiness. And then you have kind of this middle space where the holy place, the inner place, is intrinsically holy, but can be defiled and therefore needs to be cleansed as well. right? So the implements in the temple have to be cleansed in the inner and outer courts. Sin has to be atoned for. But the Holy of Holies is of such a holiness that that which comes into contact with it is made holy, right? And so that's why the ritual is the atonement ritual takes place in the Holy of Holies. And so, in a sense, there's suffering throughout the whole equation, right? Because there's blood sacrifice involved in the in the outer court, the inner court, and the inner sanctum, right? And so, that moment of suffering, yeah, I mean, I think it's there. I'm not sure how I would describe that, but that's just because hasn't occurred to me to think about that before.
I keep picturing him like Everest mountain or something. It's kind of like the peak
I'm
of
glad.
it. Is that what you were thinking, Craig, too? Or
Well, maybe for different reasons. Go on. I want to piggyback on what you're saying.
well, I think that just kind of lays out in my head this way a lot too. Like the more you're going into the temple is like the more you're kind of climbing Everest. So you're continually like if you start at the base, if you were at the beach or something, it's like, everybody can go to the beach. It's like no big deal. That you go there, relax. Like there's you just kind of can get drunk, do whatever, party on the beach. And then but then as you keep going up the mountain, it's like then you get to when he was talking about the outer court or whatever, it kind of reminded me of like maybe like base camp or something. Then you get up there and there's like more dedicated people, more like they like, okay, we've put aside these things at least for a time because we got this one purpose we're all going towards. And then when you get up to the peak, it's just you and God, and you've basically given everything to get there. Shed all. I mean, of course you're gonna have a coat on, but you know what I mean. Like you're dropping all the weight, kind of trying to get to the top of the mountain, and then it's just you're dropping all those garments of skin, all that stuff, just to get to this peak, this top of the mountain where it's just you in the heavens with God or something like that. That's kind of where my mind was going. I don't know if that's even helpful or
Yeah, no. The reason that imagery came to mind for me was because of Saint Ephraim's vision of paradise, where you have the garden as this mountain, basically, where at the top you have the tree of life, and this is, Jason, you and I had a conversation where we talked about how that imagery corresponds to the Tolkien image of Minas Tirith, this white city with the tree of life at the top.
Yeah, which is an echo of the older Valinor, of the original. Yeah, and I mean, if you think about it, like, I mean, there's probably a lot of ways to productively come up with connections to temple theology, because the temple was basically viewed as the cosmos in miniature, right? So it was supposed to kind of point in a visible way to the manner in which God is present in everything.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah.
And yeah,
I think there's very productive ways to kind of address that suffering question of like, what does the suffering entail before you pass through the veil? And in a sense, it might be like the suffering could be experienced in the groaning sense of Romans 8, of a creation groaning under the futility of sin, right? Is that groaning is like the holy place that is awaiting its repristination, right? And it's reconciliation to the same kind of holiness that comes from the Holy of Holies. And so I think that, like, yeah, there's a lot of suffering in the temple. The temple signifies a lot of suffering, just in the whole sacrificial system.
You know what I don't have enough literacy to talk about is, if I was Orthodox, I would know this, but I've heard Orthodox people talk about the structure of, maybe it's the structure of the temple, but they'll use, these are terms that are not native to me, the narthex and the nave. Are you guys familiar with these words? And how the narthex is the place where one of these regions is where there's sculptures of gargoyles or demons. I don't know. What do you know? What do you guys know about this?
There's a whole field of studies in that, actually, as far as like how, all the way back to kind of Byzantine era in early post-Constantinian era church building, all the way in through medieval Western cathedral architecture, is that all of these are in some ways recapitulating the temple. Right. And so the structure of the churches, even though the building structure is different, in a sense, it's like it's a deconstructed and reconstructed temple, like the iconostasis in the in the triptychs and you can have, you have the veil, you have the altar in most traditional churches. And a lot of churches will face east, just like the temple, just like the Holy of Holies is facing east. So the entrance to the church is facing east. And there's all kinds of ways that temple architecture and church architecture historically, now not necessarily like in your church that's in the converted strip mall down the street, wouldn't necessarily at least immediately in an apparent way that wouldn't necessarily be visible. But the early church builders, as far as for the physical buildings, the church buildings, I'm sorry, I'm just got work phone going off. The church buildings are definitely tied into temple architecture, and they were self-consciously doing that. And there's actually, Barker gets into some of that in her works. And it's because the temple mysticism of pre-Christian Judaism is picked up within early Christianity, and it's carried on in a distinctly Christian way. But it's definitely they're pulling and drawing off of those themes.
I don't know anything about that. I don't know anything about that. I mean, I've heard Peugeot talk about it a little, I think, with the gargoyles and stuff like that, but I'm not familiar with the narthex and the nave and things like that.
Well, just the word narthex is pretty rad.
Yeah.
It's got some cool edges to it that you can hang on to.
Yeah, I like what you mentioned about the receiving the pattern of the temple as like a cosmic image in a sense too, and he receives it on like what'd you say, the mountain of paradise. Like he receives it on the mountain of God in a sense. Moses goes up after basically it sounds to me like he sheds all his garments, like 40 days of no eating and drinking. It's like you're just putting it all down, like you're not partaking of anything, like all the garments of skin are just kind of being diminished. I don't know if he can really put them off, but they're being diminished in a way. And then I don't know, it's fascinating. And then even with the Garden of Eden, like Adam being created, and then I think it's the genealogy of Luke, it says he's the son of God. So he's like created that way. And then in Ezekiel, which I know is always tied to Satan, but I'm like, it sounds to me like it could have been referring to Adam as well. Because
most likely that text in Ezekiel, like the King of Tyre text, right, was almost certainly damaged in transmission.
Because it sounds like he's describing a priest. Like
it's exactly what he's describing.
Yeah, it's the same clothing the priests wear, except he's just describing it in angelic form, which makes me think of Adam in the garden or something.
So Barker has she has an extended argument that essentially like the priests believe that like the Edenic fall was mirrored as the priestly fall in the temple, right? So the priests were the guardians of Eden, and in the temple destruction, and there's more to it that she unpacks, but she makes the case that text specifically, just in terms of if you go into like the Septuagint translation and some of the older manuscript evidence, there's some pretty wild variants textually from the Masoretic text that we have today, which, Masoretic text is 11th century BC or AD, like Common Era type stuff. And so it's it's an older ancient text translation, right? But it's textual family, but there's other textual families that point to something that's more priestly. And even the connection with the king of Tyre, you know, there is a temple connection there between the Phoenicians and Solomon when he's building the temple.
Yeah,
And
that's
but
another one.
Barker makes the argument that essentially it looks like the oldest and earliest manuscript evidence points toward this is just depicting a priestly fall.
Mhm. Yeah,
And so in some ways, I mean, you know, you have to get into the question of dating of when is the Eden narrative being composed in its final form? Some people are going to put that into the time of Moses, and some people are going to put that at later times. But I'm comfortable. I mean, even though I'm fine with reading the Bible at a critical level, I'm comfortable saying that, you know, I also think that, you know, there's probably a real historical Adam or some sort of equivalent, right? And that textual tradition is arising out of, you know, a real history. But in a sense, the way that the Eden text is being framed, it is also depicting the loss of the temple, the destruction of the temple, and the fall of the priestly class and their inability to keep the temple from being defiled and themselves from being defiled.
that's fascinating.
So I want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. It sounds like what you're saying to me is that the writers of this passage about that we now see as a depiction of Lucifer was about the role of the priests and the fall of the temple.
It would appear that there's at least so like the breastplate, like typically so what's interesting is it's a somewhat approximation of the high priestly breastplate, but the stones and the arrangement have been turned around. In older text families, like that is actually the stones represented correspond to the breastplate of the high priest, right? But I mean, if you're making a later redaction that's trying to uphold like the integrity of the priesthood, you wouldn't want a text that necessarily reflects badly on that, possibly. I don't know. I mean, I think that the Hebrew Bible is abundantly critical of the priesthood. But so this argument would go, is that the earliest textual evidence kind of points more toward an understanding of this as a priestly figure. And for me, as like kind of with that reading in mind, I still have no problem with also the passage being used to give us some insight into the satanic fall, because I think that they probably correspond in a very similar way.
Yeah, I completely
Right? So I don't have a
agree.
problem with, I think that I don't have a problem with what I think is interesting about that particular, work of interpretation is like, I think it can be compatible with other readings as well. I think it's a good reading.
Yeah.
Is it the only reading of that text? By no means, right? I don't think most biblical texts, there's only one way to read them, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I think it works as a pattern fractally all the way up, all the way down. I completely agree, because it's like Lucifer is the light bringer, and that's what the priest is in a way.
Right.
He's supposed to bring the light.
And the Christian tradition and the apocalyptic literature treats it that way. So I mean, they're also reading it in that way too. So it's not like there's probably what it speaks to is that there's the Edenic fall, the priestly fall, and the satanic fall are all in a sense rhyming, right? There's a rhyme to them.
Yeah, it's like the king of Tyre, like you said, that's an office. That's describing an office, like not necessarily. I mean, it is just, you could apply it to a specific person, but it's describing an office. So it's like it's a heavenly position that doesn't fade away. And so it's the same thing. Like the other part that's always ascribed to Lucifer, Satan, is the one that says Lucifer in Isaiah 14. And if you read that, it's like it's strikingly similar to the Eden story, where it says you
Mhm.
have said in your heart, I will be like God. And that's exactly what the serpent in the garden says to them when they take the fruit. So it's like
Right.
it's the same thing. It's like it is Adam, it is Lucifer, it's all those. And because it's like a judgment that's pronounced on uh the one inhabiting that office if they do this. So it's like whoever's yeah, it's really, I don't know, it's fascinating. I think it's why, I mean, I feel like at least in our little signal group sometimes we quote this, but I think it's Luke Thompson that says it a lot, like Christ and Antichrist are like a hair's breadth away. And I know that probably sounds bad to a lot of people, but it's like you're when you're sitting up in the heavens, it's like it's an easy slip to when you're the light bringer, when God's assigned you that office, like Christ is the light of the world, you are the light of the world. It's like, well, then it's easy to think, okay, well, then I'm the light of the world. I'm God now or something. And then it's like, as soon as you make that slip, how you're, then it's like, now you hear the words, how you're falling from heaven. Oh,
Mhm.
Lucifer. Yeah. So I don't know.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think they apply to both for sure. And yeah, the description in Ezekiel is like, yeah, it growing up, so this is what I always heard growing up is that the devil was a worship leader. That's like the only thing I would ever hear about that passage. I don't know if you guys ever heard this, but it was always the devil was Satan was God's the leader in his choir, his heavenly choir, because it was, which I don't think is like, that's an interesting way to take it too. But the reason was because it says your pipes and your timbrels. And then when you actually look at the Hebrew for it, it's like your sockets is what those should be translated for, like setting gems. And then it lists all the gems, the gemstones like you're talking about that are like the same ones in the
He's
priest's
described as
garments.
he's described as a cherub,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
in the ancient world, the cherubs function had a very specific function, right? We think of cherubim as like, fat, portly little diaper angels, right? But in the there probably would more approximate a gargoyle, like or a centaur. They're species that are mixed, it's like a mixed species, and they are specifically set in place to guard sacred space, right? So the cherubim are set outside of Eden with flaming swords, right? They're guardians of sacred space. And they're in the Holy of Holies,
Yeah.
depending on what period, if you're in the tabernacle period, you have two cherubim because you have the two on the ark. If you're in the Solomonic temple, you also have cherubim in the Holy of Holies. So you have four cherubim, right? And so like,
They surround
um,
the mercy seat, right?
so and so you see that same repeating of the four in the Revelation 4 and 5 text with the four beasts around the throne. They're cherubs. It doesn't mean that they don't, their function is to behold the glory of God, to reflect the creation,
Hmm.
the diversity in creation. But they have a function of guarding sacred space.
Association with the worship leader is an interesting one. I'm curious on just to try to trace the lineage of that. I wonder if there's other things that occur to you. Again, this is evoking Tolkien for me, where you have this image of the primordial angelic figures in a choir,
Mhm.
and the evil one is the one that is trying to make these discordant notes that
Yeah.
end
Yeah.
up contributing to the harmony.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's the only association I have.
I like that. I mean, I like the association. I think it's a cool one too, because then you get into when you think of it that way, it's like there's this song of creation going on. It's like that's the song of songs in the Bible. And so you have all these angelic beings
Yeah.
singing that song, and then you have the one that tries to disrupt um, that pattern of creation in that song.
Yeah. I think probably the only way that I would bristle against that is like coming out of like the evangelical tradition I did. It's like the idea of the worship leader is kind of the guy who's on the stage with the guitar.
Yeah, that's
You know
sort
what I
of
mean?
yeah. Uh-huh.
And like I think that the picture of Lucifer pre-fallen or post-fallen is uh an incredibly powerful, radiant or dark force in the cosmos because of the proximity to the divine presence. And you know, and the initial function, if he's a cherub, he's there to basically gatekeep and be a guardian of that sacred space. And so if you think of like a cherub falling out of its function, it's a treasonous act, you know, and so it's, you know, it's a, the fall was a fairly treacherous event.
I wonder what you guys think, based on what you just said, Jed. It makes me curious. What is an appropriate vision for us to have, or what the character of Lucifer is like, or if it even is appropriate to
I
have
think,
that character as one in our.
I mean, I can only speak to my own opinion on this. I wouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily say like this is the way it has to be viewed. Like I think like, you know, we're cautioned against like reviling angelic authorities, whether they be hostile or benevolent. My sense is that whatever Lucifer is at present, his true created state, how he was intended, was something of you know, rather radiant, and a rather radiant and glorious being, right? And I don't think that has been even wholly effaced from him, right? And so there is a sense where, you know, he takes that beauty and he perverts it in a seductive way, but it's still beautiful, right? There's still a beauty to it. There's still a grandeur and a kind of a dark anti-majesty, right? Just like you know, just like an antichrist would be so similar to Christ. There's a majestic element to that, but it's also quite dangerous, because it can appear one way, but in its inner depths can be quite poisonous and toxic. And I think like Tolkien's metaphors and Tolkien's work kind of points to that in kind of the initial Dark Lord. Like his intentions were good. Like, you know, his intentions were good. It's just the way he went about things led him further and further away from God, and then ultimately his desire to do good for creation, it was actually the means through which he did incredible damage to it. Right? And so you know, I try not to like try to probe into the deep things of Satan or anything like that, but it, you know, it reminds me of like a broken mirror, right?
Okay. Yeah, so going off that, I might have some questions that could maybe even lead into this idea of like whether or not Satan could be redeemed or no. I don't know if we'd have to talk about other things first, but I might have to say something first before I can get to my question. So when you asked the question, Craig, how would you perceive Satan? I used to say, like, if I ever want to look at Satan, I should just look in the mirror, which I know is probably not helpful and it's probably not good for most people to hear. But it kind of like as in referencing maybe the worship of self or something. Because from what I understand, I think that's what Satanism is worshiping yourself. So it is kind of that broken mirror, like Jed talks about, like uh, you're looking in the mirror, but it's all broken. And if it's just yourself, you can't see all the other people you should be looking at or something. And I don't know that it's necessarily like just a narcissist. I guess maybe it could be. But okay, so I guess my first question, I don't know if Jed's still listening, it's kind of one for him too. But if that
I'm still listening. I'm chewing
okay,
on food.
okay, all right. If that is kind of an all right, if that's a correct way of looking at it, um, what is that redeemable in nature? Like, is that I don't I guess I'm trying to even think of how to phrase my question now, I guess. Because it seems like something like that is almost necessary for, I don't know how to phrase this, self-identity or something. But it almost seems like a fall. And I'm okay with saying that the fall, and I think you said this before, Jed, too, that I'm okay with saying the fall is good because it's kind of like you find yourself outside of God's identity. So like you find individuality within the multiplicity in that or something. It's like something like that sort of happens. I don't know
I
if
think
that's
there's a
true.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that the fall was good.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't ascribe like the force of like metaphysical necessity to the fall, but I think freedom makes it an inevitability,
Okay. That's a better way
right?
to phrase
And
it for
so
sure.
um that like so Saint Irenaeus describes the fall as kind of having a instructive or pedagogical function, right? So we leave the gates of Eden and we enter in east of Eden into the school of righteousness. um, and we learn that through our encounter with the unrighteousness of the world, right? In a creation that is now fallen. um yeah, I mean, this was always, in the historic arguments around universalism, like there was always some sort of controversy around, well, if you push universalism to its, well, its full conclusion, like to its fullest implications, then you're going to have to say that there is a redemption of Satan at some point, right? And so, and I actually do agree with that. I think that um, the to say that Satan would at some point not be redeemed would be to leave some remainder of creation that will be forever diabolized, even if that's just Satan himself, which would represent to me a certain kind of failure for God to bring about the ultimate good of creation in all things. So I don't have a problem with the concept of the eventual, reconciliation of Satan, but I mean, he'll have to repay his debt down to the uttermost farthing, right, to the last cent, because of the damage he's done in creation. So his redemptive path would probably be a long and arduous one, that may last as long as the universe itself. Like it may take that long. But I do think that there is a redemption even there. The mechanism, I think, is the same mechanism that is the redemption of human beings, right? I think that the whole of creation is redeemed in Christ, and to a sense, in a certain sense, even the angels are defectible, right? They're still described as the holy ones, just like the saints on earth are described as the holy ones, right? Are we that holy, practically speaking? Well, not always, right? I mean, we know that, but Paul would, if Paul was writing a letter to us today, to the saints at Almond Tree, right? We'd have to, that we never say that about ourselves or about Christians without a certain sense of irony, because we know, as mortal beings, we struggle with morality in very profound ways. The manner in which that plays itself out in the angelic world, I couldn't say with any certainty as far as what the mechanisms are of, moral fall and moral redemption and those kinds of things. I don't know how that would work, except to say that, like, I don't have a problem with that, at least conceptually, that, um, perfection is something that is readily, it belongs to God. The divine perfection belongs to God, and but finite beings have to be perfected, right? And so that doesn't mean that, like, the angels who have devoted themselves in service to God don't have a certain kind of moral impeccability to them, but I just would say that they're probably not infallible, right? So we don't worship angels in those kinds of things. They're created beings like us. So I would suspect that as created beings, they have similar vulnerabilities even outside of the strictures of mortality.
There's a very unsavory but beautiful implication of the idea that Satan would be redeemed, because if he's going to be redeemed completely, restored completely, you could imagine him as, again, this kind of day star, this shining one again, which I think evokes a kind of visceral disgust reaction from some people. But I wonder what you think about it. It's beautiful to me, and I feel like it harmonizes with the story of Saul becoming Paul, where this, this adversary becomes the herald.
Mhm. I think, that I guess the place that my mind goes is like, what would it look, because like, not only would Satan have to be, in returning to Lucifer and becoming and being restored to the light bearer, like, would not only have to experience divine forgiveness, so being forgiven of his sins and his crimes against God, but also have to be embraced by the very creation that he had damaged. Right.
Yeah.
So like the totalizing effect of a redemption on that level is somewhat terrifying to me, because of what that would actually entail. Like what does that process look like? Is that's because where we sit now, like kind of in a sense, in a world under satanic control in a sense, right, is we live under the weight of his crimes, right, and we suffer and we languish under that, and that we want justice. And like, so I think that side of it, like, it's very hard to imagine some far end of creation where all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're cool. Because it's like we can't say that now, and so the enmity is still very much present, but I think that we're called to contend with our enemies without hatred, right? Like, I think that the outrage of the crimes that Satan and those who have willfully served him have perpetrated on humanity are horrendous. But they can take that hatred that we feel toward them and that resentment and twist that in all kinds of different ways. So I don't think that like our cries for justice are inappropriate. I don't think that our sense of there needs to be some sort of retribution, I think that that's wholly appropriate. But again, it's like, that's where I still think it's wisest to approach those issues from a Christian perspective of vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I will repay. Right? Because he's in a position where he can do so with wisdom and to bring about real justice.
This is go ahead, Jason.
No, you go. I'm probably gonna
Okay.
just like,
Well-
once I start talking, I might just go for a while, so I don't know.
So this is a question. So Jed, I have the impression from last time we spoke, and something you said here too, that Bulgakov is a really big part of your way of seeing the world. And you mentioned retribution. I wonder how retribution fits into a universalist way of seeing the world. Because maybe I'm incorrect. Bulgakov is fiercely universalist. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think like I straddle some interesting lines in universalist thought. I don't look at hell as necessarily like an eternal torture chamber or anything of the sort. But I think that like if we're looking at the biblical principle of justice, talionic justice, so lex talionis of like an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of justice, would be called like the law of equal measure. So the older codes prior to the Mosaic Code that calls for like a principle of retribution is the retribution must always be proportionate to the crime. If you go into like Hammurabi's law code, like if your ox gores somebody, like you're going to be liable for a certain amount, like up to death. But then like if your ox continues to gore and like kill people, they'll kill your whole family. That's the punishment, right? So it's not proportionate to the crime, right? So I do think that there's a place for retribution that's proportionate to the crime, even though the overall picture of justice is restorative. Like there needs to be proper recompense for the crime committed, right? And so I think like when you think about like the magnitude of the satanic fall, like there's that proportional justice, those proportions are terrifying, and our participation in that, that's why we cast ourselves on Christ's mercy, is because like in some degree we're all implicated in that to one degree or another. Like none of us are that great, you know. We're implicated in that same reality. So while I do think mercy is always at play for all of God's creatures, like I also think justice is worth trembling before, right? And so I think like any sort of final reconciliation will also be ultimately fair, right? It's not like anybody's getting away with anything. So yeah, but I don't have a problem with certain measures of retribution, and neither would Bulgakov, you know, or like a great, you know, like you can read some of George MacDonald's Universalist sermons. Like his picture of ultimate reconciliation is really an excruciating one, because like of all the things you have to come to grips with in your journey toward union with God, you have to come to grips with yourself. You will never escape yourself. You have to come to grips with who God created you to be, and that process, if you're resisting God's love, it could, you know, in at least in MacDonald's imagination, could take just an inordinate amount of time.
Yeah.
That is recalling to me the image of, you know, like piercing the veil. Like that's that place of suffering that you have to enter through.
Yeah.
And Christ takes all of that dereliction upon himself, so that none of it would ultimately destroy his creatures.
I'm making a lot of faces. Sorry. I completely agree. I just, it's just incredibly fascinating. And, it's like terribly complex and extremely simple at the same time, it seems to me in my head. But, because it's just, the one hiccup where I have, I think it goes back to Craig's original question, is with Lucifer. If I think of Satan as an angelic being, as a fallen angel, I can easily see his redemption, easily. But if I think of him as like the essence of self-worship or something like that, I don't necessarily know how that could be reconciled or redeemed, because that seems so contrary to love in a way. Unless, but that's what I mean. If he's just or maybe where maybe I'm getting hung up in like there's some sort of like dualism in my mind where like those two are kind of connected. Like the self worship is kind of like some weird self love, and it's just perverted. And once it's reconciled, it will work properly or something, and then work in a way with in a proper way with creation. Maybe that's what it is. But the whole thing with the angels, the fallen angels receiving mercy, I think I'm totally on board with, because it just there's this idea. Well, I mean, it's in the scripture, but also I think in the book of Enoch too, where the angels are just curious about man. They're like, what is man? Like, what is this? What is this little worm you've created? This little maggot down here that has to suffer? And it's like, what are you working in this creature? And then through the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, Christ receives a better name than the angels. And then it says in Corinthians, don't you know that you're going to judge angels? And it's like, they're curious about this creation because God's creating merciful creatures. Because in this life of suffering, it's like our eyes are open to see how much we need the love of God and mercy. And so through that, in us, we'll be able to pour that out, even upon angels, even upon fallen angels. And I think the torment is something like you're talking about, coming to terms with that. Like if you, I mean, because this is an example I think we probably just use too often, and I use it way too often too, but you could think of Hitler too. It's like, I could forgive Hitler, but what good does that do it? Like, I don't have his forgiveness necessarily. If he had to go through the line of every single face that he had harmed and had to ask forgiveness and they had to forgive him, it's like, there's a certain type of torment in all of that where it's like I think it's like having to wrestle with yourself and the things you did is like having to go through that. I don't, it's like it feels like maybe to some people I might be reducing the fire, but I'm like that's if you resist that, you're going to be in torment anyways. And then to actually engage in that is almost torment in itself. So it's like you kind of have to go through the fire either way. And then the longer you resist it, the longer you're just going to stay in this eternal fire until you turn to it. And then it's like, okay, let's go through the fire then and get into this holy of holies or something like that.
Yeah, it's why we want to go through that as much of the purgation on this side of things.
Yeah.
And we go through the refiner's fire on this side, but I mean, I in an unironic sense, I am an annihilationist as well. I just don't think any being gets annihilated.
Yeah.
But Satan gets annihilated. He just, in his annihilation is his redemption and his return to his original and final state, right?
Yeah.
And so, to put it in Hegelian terms, the negation has to get negated, right? And so, like, he is going to, like, you know, like, whatever hell is, at least in my mind, it is the progressive annihilation of evil.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's like if
And
Satan.
so,
Oh, sorry. Yeah, if
yeah,
Satan
the
actually had to.
judgment texts are too. The judgment texts in the Bible are too. There's too much destruction in those texts to fully eliminate the fact that there is a real destruction that takes place,
Mhm.
right? So it's not like, the universalist perspective is somehow light on this stuff. It's, and in some ways it's so, like, have you guys read the Inferno? So Dante's Inferno.
I
One
read
of the
all of it.
curious things, one of the curious things in the Inferno is nobody in the Inferno ever asked to get out, which is interesting, right? While they are in torment, there's almost a placid resignation. So one of the interesting things, there's a great book by a literary scholar in the 20th century named Erich Auerbach, and he writes a book called Dante, the Poet of the Modern World, right? And so he does this profound analysis of what, in a sense, what Dante's doing is he's making the earthly and temporal existence just stretches on into eternity. So whatever you are at death, it's he says it basically gives rise to the West's highly individualistic consciousness, right? So Dante is a signifier of that shift into, like, this sense of being the everlasting individual. And even if you have to be that everlasting individual in hell, you will be that kind of thing, right? But I don't think that, while that's an interesting thing to study in terms of the history and development of thought in the West, I don't think that that's the picture that is actually being presented to us in the judgment metaphor and imageries in Scripture, right? So, I don't think that, like, the thing about the universalist picture that's actually maybe a little bit more terrifying than Dante is in Dante's Inferno, there's a placid resignation to their estate, right? I'm damned and I'm just going to be damned forever. So there's no need to improve. There's no need to grow out of the circle of hell that you find yourself in, right? And the universalist picture is, no, you will not ever escape who you were actually made to be. And so until you have become that, you are going to feel the fire.
Yeah.
And so you have there is a creaturely response that is always held out to us, that either we're going to move toward redemption or away from it, but you can never stay in the middle for any protracted period of time. So you're just not going to escape yourself and who God made you to be.
There's this I think it's kind of reminding me of yeah, it's interesting that I think the more I have personally embraced universalism, the more hell became more real. And I feel like the more I actually had to wrestle with it, because before it's like it's kind of get out of jail free card, and the more I embrace universalism, it's like no, you kind of you all have to go through the fire, and it's like and it becomes a lot more real. But when you were talking, it reminded me of this verse in the Bible, and I was talking with Cal and this other guy Peter the other day, and Peter brought it up because we were talking about 23 Minutes of Hell. Are you guys familiar with that book at all? this guy who said
I'm not familiar.
it's kind of like, I guess he had an out of body experience and he went to hell for like 23 minutes and he experienced all this stuff. But there was a part in there where I guess like people were asking him questions and they were like, so you saw people down there and their flesh was burning off of them and it just melted off of them. And it just eternally did this. And they were like, and he was like, yeah. And they were like, well, what did the flesh just reappear, then melt off again? And he was like, yeah. And I was just like, and then when Peter brought it up, I was like, that's actually a verse in Zechariah where it's like their flesh will dissolve while they stand on their feet and stuff like that. And I'm like, there's I don't know why, just when you were talking, it reminded me of that, of just like this, you're not, when you're talking about, even if you're in that state, in hell, in kind of this torment state, because that reminds me of something you'd probably read in Dante or something like that. But it's not a resignation to be there. It's like you have to, it's like that is a redemptive process in a way or something, or trying to get you to turn, I guess, back to, I don't know what I'm getting at now. It's just popped in my head, but there is
It
this
reminds
thing.
me,
Sorry, go
I can
ahead.
tell you guys about a kind of like I had an experience of hell.
Oh man.
You would think it would have had more of a change on me at the time than it did, but um, I struggle with bipolar disorder, and so have had some serious substance abuse problems in the past, like and a lot of times it wasn't like persistent substance abuse. There were times where that was the case, but when I was in my 20s, I just partied really hard. That was what I did. So I was out partying one night with friends and had been drinking heavily, and then blacked out and evidently had gone and done a bunch of drugs somewhere. I don't even remember. Like I still have a very vivid memory of the circumstances that gave rise to the experience. But I ended up in the hospital, right? And I went to hell. I was in hell, like literally, probably, like the experience. It took me about 4 or 5 hours to come back into consciousness, right? I felt like I was gone for a very, very long time, like much longer than that. Like in a sense, it felt like ages kind of thing. But I found myself kind of sinking down into this deep pit, right? And I kind of fell through the pit, and I just fell into like empty space. So think of empty space, cosmos, stars, nebulas, galaxies, all that kind of stuff. And I felt utterly alone in the universe. Like the only thing I could be aware of, even with seeing everything in front of me, all this beautiful stuff, I was totally detached from it. So I'm in front of this very beautiful reality, and then I'm totally alone, right? And then it would shift, and I'd be in the company of people like family members, people I loved, and the same thing, totally isolated, totally alone, even in the company of others. And then I kind of went into a kind of a sense of replay of my life to that point, and just remember there's like kind of a voice that just kept reverberating in my head, was, I didn't save you to live like this. And I remember like the sense of just like agony and the utter dislocation and distance that I felt within myself from God and from everything, while having some sort of awareness that they're still out there. And it did have a profound effect on me, but I still live with the reality of mental illness. So it wasn't like everything cleaned up all at once or anything like that, but it was an important experience. And I think like probably very reflective of just kind of the inner conflicts that I was already feeling within myself at that period in my life anyway. But it was very much, I felt like there was a sense of burning in that experience, but it wasn't like a hot fire or anything like that. But it was this sense of like, just this gnawing, deep sense of like regret that you could not I couldn't remove myself from that. And my experience of like coming, when I finally came awake, it was because I felt like I was being pulled out, right, out of this pit. And then I'm like awake and my family members are there and that kind of stuff. Very embarrassing experience, honestly. But yeah, I've had those kind of experiences. They're terrifying, and it's like, while I don't remember the circumstances of the night, I can recall that experience. You know, it's like almost total recall. I can go back into that. And it was very much the experience of hell. It was terrifying, right? And I think at least one aspect, I don't think it's the total reality of what that experience might be, but it showed me like the, you know, if it retrospectively, from the perspective of this was almost, gosh, this was getting close to 20 years ago, right? So it's quite some time ago, but retrospectively, it makes me think of just like what the true cost of an egocentric life and an egocentric existence is. Because I was locked within myself. And so I think like there, you know, that those kinds of destructive and terrifying imagery of you know, of judgment is like, I think that those things are a mercy to us because they tell us to avoid that, right? They teach us to move toward love and goodness and mercy. Because I think like the real experience of like having to come to grips with yourself, the more we can embrace that process here, the better things look. But yeah, I mean, I still, as a universalist, I probably think more about hell now than like when I was looking at it as the get out of jail free card and I'm totally immune from it, right? Because I still see a place that I could very much, I could be there.
Yeah, that's terrifying. That's more terrifying than like imagining fire to me, or the scripture I quoted. It's this alone, being alone. That's why I think I would rather burn alive than, I've said this before, I'd rather probably burn alive than drown in the sea. I don't know what that is. Like I can't say that definitively because I've never been set on fire, but like the thought of sinking down, like you're talking about, into blackness and darkness, in the where sound doesn't reach you, light doesn't reach you, just you're totally alone, like the bottom of the ocean. Just kind of, that sounds absolutely terrifying to me. And that's and so universalist is kind of like saying if it's not all, it's not complete, it's not perfect, and there's something lost still, and there's still a little bit of hell in that, in a way, because there's something not yet redeemed. There's something if your hell is being separated from others and isolated within yourself, then it's like you need all the others to truly be complete, in a way. And so you need all of God's creation. Yeah. But that's hard to wrestle with, and that is hard to wrestle with. Like even getting back to the Satan thing, like if Satan could be redeemed, like what does he actually has to receive forgiveness and reconciliation from the very creation he corrupted. And it's like, that's a hell in itself. I don't know. Seems like it. Craig, you said one time, because I remember you said it, I think you said it kind of as a very, as a joke, but I don't think it was a joke. And I thought it was a really good idea. But you said, because we said something about Rob Bell's book, Love Wins. And you said, I should write my own book called Hell Wins. And I was like, yes, you should. Like, I think it would be very similar, actually, if hell actually won. But I don't know if you meant it the same way, but I thought it was a very interesting point. But the fire.
I'm serious. No, I mean that, Jed, that burning away, that destructive aspect of hell that you described, when you said that you were an annihilationist, but only for Satan. You know, this is something people that talk to me a lot will know, but it seems like that imagery, you know, of this passing through the furnace, whether it's, you know, it's either purgatorial or it's, you know, it'll annihilate you. And that seems really, really deeply embedded, you know, in the Christian fantasy.
It makes me want to, I want to grab a poem. I'm going to go ahead and grab it.
Okay.
So give me a minute. I'll be back.
Okay.
Like I won't probably be able to hear you because I got to go into the other room to grab it, but I'll be right back with that.
Okay.
You got
Okay.
it.
Okay. Is that I have a question, Craig, too, while he's doing that. Is the the purgatorial aspect, so that's the right way to say it, is that could it be both? Like, can it be annihilation? Because
It
isn't
is
the
both.
okay,
Yeah.
that's what I was thinking. The purgatory aspect is actually annihilating aspects of you into or something like that,
Well,
or
what happens to the thing you put in the fire depends on what it is you put in the fire.
yeah.
It's either going to burn
Mhm.
up or it's going to be refined.
Or yeah, or made, yeah. Or then the dross is going to be taken off of it. Yeah,
Mhm.
that seems to be the imagery and like yeah, in the scriptures the whole time. It's like I'm gonna put you through the refiner's fire and get off the dross. And it's like, and I think it even says that in a lot of places, like whatever uh put through the fire, whatever can withstand the fire is gonna come out. And the stuff that can't handle it. And I mean it says like our God is a consuming fire. That's what says that in Deuteronomy, I think.
Yep.
That's interesting. Say more about
Yeah.
it, man.
It seems really substantial that the text is obsessed with both the burning up aspect of fire, and it really emphasizes that metaphor, but it also emphasizes it's obsessed with this image of the fire, where let's say the objects that can be in the fire and withstand it. Like you see that in Daniel, and you see it in the burning bush, and you see like it's all over the place.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. So I'm sorry I missed what you guys were talking about. I hope I'm not.
Oh, we were just
Um,
talking about the purgatory aspect of hell being also
okay.
the annihilating aspect as well. That
All
it's
right.
probably both.
Well, then this fits perfectly.
Nice.
So this comes and like probably one of the most important poems I've ever read is T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. I don't know if you've read that, but it's one of the most challenging and rewarding pieces of literature I've ever read. But this is I refer to this one a lot, but it's just because um, it's such a powerful section. It's toward the end of the poem. It's in a section called Little Gidding, and this is the fourth motion within that work. So it reads this: the dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare the one discharge from sin and error, the only hope or else despair lies in the choice of pyre or pyre, to be redeemed from fire by fire. Who then devised the torment? Love. Love is the unfamiliar name behind the hands that wove the intolerable shirt of flame, which human power cannot remove. We only live, only suspire, consumed by either fire or fire. And so, I mean, it's such that whole, I would recommend that poem to anybody. It takes quite a bit of patience to kind of mine its treasures because it's very difficult. But yeah, like the hell is the love of God, like
Yeah.
that meets our unlovingness and how far in our alienation, and it's fire,
Yeah.
and so like we're redeemed from the fire by fire. And I think that's actually like signified in Pentecost, right? In Pentecostal fire.
Oh.
um
Mhm.
and that's, I mean, so the throne room vision in the Enochic literature, like he's in this heavenly holy of holies, and the curtains look like tongues of fire. Well, that's
Wow.
directly
Yeah.
directly referenced in the book of Acts with Pentecost. It's those tongues of fire from the holy of holies that's descending upon the inhabitants of the world, and that they are lit up, and they're encountering, in a sense, the love of God, the holy of holies presence of God.
Really
And
interesting.
so they are, in a sense, redeemed through the fire, right? And that's right out of First Corinthians as well. First Corinthians chapter 3, like everyone's going to pass through the fire, and we're going to have our works and the life and what we've made of our lives is going to be tested with fire, all of us,
That's really
right?
good. That's
And so
fascinating
I
because
don't think it's escaping that.
makes me think of the seraphim, because the
So
tongues
there
of
is no fire insurance.
yeah,
All will be salted by fire, right?
but tongues are
Love
often
wins, baby.
But that,
That's how it wins.
yeah.
that's right. There we go. I like it.
How, but I don't know. The tongues of fire reminds me of the seraphim because it's like they're often you can sometimes see a tongue like a serpent, the way it moves and stuff. And I'd never thought of that before. And that's right before even Isaiah, when he comes in, he sees God on the throne. He says, "There's seraphim," and then the seraphim actually puts a coal in his mouth to purify his tongue, which I never connected those before. That's really interesting. But you care if I read this? You've probably read this before, Jed. I guess it's George MacDonald, but it's kind of very related to the poem you just read and everything we're
Sure.
talking about love being the fire. It's from his. I still haven't read all of his unspoken sermons, but this is one. I think it was maybe the second chapter, and it was called "Consuming Fire," about God being a
Oh, yeah.
consuming fire. Yeah, and it says,
Mhm.
and I think Sherry's quoted this before too. But for love loves unto purity. Love has ever in view the absolute loveliness of that which it beholds. Where loveliness is incomplete, and love cannot love its fill of loving, it spends itself to make more lovely, that it may love more. It strives for perfection, even that itself may be perfected, not in itself, but in its object. As it was love that first created humanity, so even human love, in proportion to its divinity, will go on creating the beautiful for its own outpouring. There is nothing eternal but that which loves and can be loved, and love is ever climbing towards the consummation when such shall be the universe, imperishable, divine. Therefore, all that is not beautiful in the beloved, all that comes between and is not of love's kind, must be destroyed. And our God is a consuming fire. So there's that hell wins.
Mhm.
I guess. I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, I don't think that the universalist picture is like light on judgment, right? And I don't think that like we have to. I actually think it enables us to speak to judgment with a lot more confidence and clarity, because we know that the judgment will be just and not like a cartoonish parody of justice, right? It will be like in that, the law of equal measure, like it will not be disproportionate to the crimes committed, right? So a finite crime cannot result in an infinite punishment, but that doesn't mean that a finite crime doesn't have a certain kind of magnitude to it that has to get dealt with. And so, you don't have to shy away from the fact that no, this is something like we should all tremble before. Like it's not like, it was always weird to me that people who are, dead set against universalists seem to paint it with this brush, like, hey, this is, you're just kind of glossing over sin. It's like, by no means, is that actually the case. And in fact, I don't know how you get around that if hell is everlasting, then in some sense sin is as well. And and so there's sin that never gets dealt with.
That's a deep point. That's a really deep point.
So it's like, we're got to deal with this stuff. Like, it's going to get dealt with. Like it will get dealt with in the context of love and graciousness and mercy, and it's ultimately for our our well-being. But like, just like an addict like me, having had dealt with some serious substance abuse issues, like, you don't get through that without having to face yourself and coming to grips with what your addiction has done to you and to people you love. Right.
Yeah.
And so, like, in a sense, like, yeah, hell is like a hospital or like rehab, but anybody who's ever been to, ever been in, seriously mangled in a car wreck knows how difficult that medical journey is to rehabilitation. Or if you have, if you've fallen into addiction, like how painful the rehabilitation process is. But it is your process and your path of healing at the same time. Like, and you do get to a point in recovery where you don't it's not a masochistic sense, but you don't want to shortchange yourself from allowing yourself to face reality. Right. And so it's like, no, I need to sit with this for a little while so that I make sure that I've learned what I need to learn so that I don't repeat these behaviors. And that can be difficult, but you get to a point in the redemptive and the restorative process where you actually embrace that process. Like you fight it at first, like, all your problems are somebody else's fault and somebody, but at the end of the day, your choices are your choices. Whatever the context your choices are made in that you had no control over, you still make your choices. You got to deal with that. Right. So for me, with my alcohol problem, right, I had to deal with that. And like nobody held a bottle to my mouth and made me drink. Like I was always a volitional act. Right. And it's something that like we do have to deal with it. Like you have to sometimes embrace the painful parts of the healing too, and I think that's the way we all have to come to grips with that in ourselves in some way. And so, I think that there is a sense where, like my friend Jordan Wood speaks because of he has an interesting blend of the metaphysics of Maximus the Confessor, but also uses Maximus to read Hegel, right? And because they do have similar patterns of thought, even though Maximus is more in an ancient inflection, right? One of the things he talks about is that like the restoration of all things means the restoration of time itself, because time is a being, which means that time itself has to get healed. So like that sense of like when I was in the judgment, in my own sense of like having to see my life and to have it play before my eyes and to understand at some level where things went wrong. I think there's an element of the judgment that something like that is in play in judgment. But also there's a sense where we're going to have to go through and repair what was damaged and bring good where evil once was. That's how evil gets negated through the whole system. So it's not like at the far end of whatever the final restoration of all things is, like that means that time gets redeemed as well. And so the redemption of time is, I think, us coming to grips with our actions. And I don't know what the mechanism of repair is. That's hard for me to, I wouldn't say I claim to understand that, but I do think that there is an element of judgment where we either join Christ in seeing how he has repaired that on our behalf and see how his mercy makes those things new, or if we've rejected that mercy, we have some responsibility to actually face that and make good on that on our own. And so I think hell is actually, in a sense, it's the so the picture, if you want to go back into Ezekiel, like if you go into Ezekiel 47, you get this really interesting picture, and it's kind of out of the Araba traditions, the Sea of Araba, the Dead Sea, right? Very interesting if you do a kind of a study around just that geographic feature within the biblical history. Like it's really loaded with a lot of theological significance, but probably nowhere in the Hebrew Bible more so than in Ezekiel, right? And what happens is the eschatological temple appears, and there's this river that runs from Zion and down the Kidron Valley, and then I believe Kidron Valley, but then the Kidron Valley ultimately terminates in the Dead Sea. And so this stream of fresh water goes into the Dead Sea and it cleans the water. Like, so the dead waters become living. There's some salt that remains, but it's the salt that's useful for, food and all that kind of stuff. But like the picture is like this restoration that is being affected from Zion, that is transforming the Dead Sea into a living reality. And like, I actually think that between that, you see this throne room scene I think in Daniel 7, right? The river of fire, well, where's the throne, and where are these things taking place? Well, you're in Jerusalem. The temple is facing east toward the Dead Sea, right? So the whole orientation of these visions are taking place with the Dead Sea. So that river of fire is like the Jordan River coming into the sea. So the fiery imagery in Daniel is probably quite complementary with the water image in Ezekiel. And John picks up on that and actually stacks those metaphors in Revelation, and that is the lake of fire. Like, if you're looking for your geographic marker, now, is that literally the lake of fire? I don't know, but I think that at least John's picking up on that imagery. The lake of fire is the laundry room of the cosmos, where things get cleaned up and cleansed and washed and made new. Right. So the way that works is hard to say, but the imagery, the biblical imagery, I think, is fairly compelling. That if we look at the Dead Sea tradition in the Hebrew Bible, in the apocalyptic literature, all the way in through the New Testament, like, I don't know what else John would be picturing as the lake of fire. It's
That
just
was a nuclear bomb you just dropped on us.
Yeah,
that's
that was
really-
really
that's-
good. River of life is the fire issuing, the fiery stream issuing from the throne. I do have a question. Is the Dead Sea geographically, is that located near Sodom and Gomorrah where they were?
Yeah, I mean, it's Sodom and Gomorrah are probably submerged somewhere in the Dead Sea.
The asphalt pits, things like that. Yeah, that's interesting. Because then you have the fire associated with the sea there as well. Yeah, like you're talking about.
Right.
The cleansing property.
Like, it is a place of, it is a painful place, but is a place of restoration.
Yeah, and yet the cosmic, the gosh, what is that? In Revelation, you said the sea of fire is like a cosmic image. Like, I think you get that, if I remember right, you get that in the books of Enoch. Like, he goes through these layers of the cosmos and he sees this great fire that exists in the, it's like an internal cosmic image of something in the heavens. Yeah.
Right. And so, like, even where you get into the question of the smoke of their torment goes up for the ages of the ages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what is that smoke but what is getting burned off is, and so what the saints are rejoicing in there is not the destruction of the wicked, but the destruction of wickedness. Right. And so what is going up is, in a sense, it's an offering to God.
Yeah.
Right. What is being, and so it's just it's a far more intensified experience of restoration and redemption. And so I don't think, like, when people will say that, the book of Revelation is talking about eternal conscious torment, I'm like, you're not reading the biblical image. You're not even reading the biblical imagery correctly in its own terms, because Ezekiel 47 is absolutely influencing the lake of fire imagery in John. Like, John's using Ezekiel all over the place. There's no way that's not, like, he's not picking up on a very dense and layered tradition that's already there already. So
that's really interesting.
I think that's what's going on there.
That's really cool. Yeah, I've always connected the river of life, of course, and I think a lot of people do that, but I never connected the fire imagery as well. That makes a lot of sense.
I think, like, Daniel and Ezekiel are, like, kind of two of the major textual reference that John picks up time and time again in Revelation, right?
Yeah,
so
that's so much fun.
That throne room vision. But I mean, where, when John's looking, where's he looking from when he's seeing the sea of fire? Christ's return to earth. Well, where's he returning? He's, like, I think that John is probably well aware of the Mount of Olives tradition, that he, will return to the Mount of Olives, because it's coming right out of not only his own words, and the angelic witness, but it's out of Malachi. Well, where's the Mount of Olives? What is the eastern vista of the Mount of Olives? Well, it's the Dead Sea, right? So when he's casting people into the lake of fire, that's the referent. Now, is that literally going to play out that way in terms of I think it's giving us at least the conceptual imagery and a conceptual framework by, just understanding a little bit of the geography of what's at play in that literature.
Okay, so you said that the Dead Sea is east of the Mount of Olives, right?
Right.
Okay, that's interesting too. I'm not sure what to do with that
The
yet.
Mount of
That's
Olives,
fascinating.
like, so if you're looking directly from
Hmm.
directly from the Temple Mount, right?
Yeah.
The Holy of Holies is facing east,
Okay. Yeah.
and it's almost in direct view of like the Mount of Olives,
Uh-huh.
right? So probably that's Gethsemane is probably located very close to where the Mount of Olives is, right? Because in Roman
Yeah.
law, you had to be crucified where the crime took place.
Uh-huh.
So wherever he was arrested was probably also very close to where he was crucified. And
Okay.
so the vision directly from the Holy of Holies looking east, so to the rising sun, is to Calvary. And if you look further east beyond Calvary, you're going to look out over, I mean, your eastward orientation is going to put you right
The
into
Lake of Fire.
the Dead Sea.
That's really it's just fascinating because it's like I'm not sure what to do with it yet, but you may have know more than I do. So yeah, the garden where Jesus is being pressed and he weeps before he goes to the cross, he's being pressed like an olive. The Garden of Gethsemane was like full of olive trees. It was on the Mount of Olives. And then it's like you're saying, and what he's going to come back in Zechariah and stand on the Mount of Olives, like he's going to be pressing something again. Then I think it says it's going to be split and divided in half, right? And one side, like you're talking about, is to the lake of fire. The other side's to Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, or something like that. I don't know what to do with all that.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's like I think it's all in a constellation of images that
Yeah,
fit
yeah.
together. I can't tell you exactly how that all fits together, but it's like John seems to be crystallizing some key images there
Yeah, yeah.
that, like, even if he's not directly referencing them, like he's certainly aware of it, and it's certainly lingering in the background. So it's like he knows where Jesus is crucified. So that if you're thinking of just some of the geographical markers, like obviously a lot of what's happening in Revelation is a vision of the throne room, right? But that's corresponding to the earthly Jerusalem. And so there's some value in kind of understanding, like, well, when John's referring to like the temple in Revelation 11, right, and the two witnesses who are there, like he's like there's clearly like a geographical element at play there, right?
Yeah.
Now, what does the temple mean in the text? Is it literally the temple on the Temple Mount? Is it literally two witnesses? Those kinds of things. Well, maybe not, but
Well, it seems to me like it could be, because it seems like even if it's a cosmic image or like a heavenly image, those things seem to work fractally all the time. So it could be individuals or multiple individuals, all those sorts of things. Yeah, it's just
I think, yeah, I mean, I
fascinating.
like, my answer to that question is yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is just
So I
really
think that they
super
are,
interesting.
I
I'm not
think
sure what
that
to do with.
they are kind of, those images come to us with both a particular and a universal applicability.
Yeah, there's just a lot of imagery, like kind of that's embedded in there.
So
I'm not
we
sure.
are the two witnesses as the witnessing community. We are the two witnesses, right? And a testimony is established by two witnesses. So valid testimony in the court of law, two witnesses, right? That's the function of the witnessing community. And they're the place where they are, they're being witnessing unto martyrdom where the Lord was crucified, right? So they're joining him and they're testifying to Christ's redemptive work in history. That's what they're doing. And that's what the witnessing community is called to. So that those mantles, those prophetic mantles, have always been the inheritance of the kingdom community, right, of the church. Is there a particularity there too? I leave that open. Of course, I think so. But does it have to be? Well, no, it could just be symbolic. But I don't have a problem, allowing ourselves to kind of see ourselves in those characters. I think we should see ourselves in all the biblical characters, right? And in some way they are connected to us and we're connected to them. And so, yeah, I mean, those concepts, I think, are supposed to awaken into us like a sense of the importance that, that our lives have to God, and the potential that they have to advance the interest of his kingdom. If you choose to.
This stuff is great. I think it's great. It's fascinating to me. Craig, what do you got to say?
I agree. I think this is probably a really good place to start winding down.
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
the witnesses. I don't know if I want to. There's a bunch of other stuff like I wanted to bring up that we didn't get to really dig into, I guess, as much, but I'm definitely gonna be chewing on all this. Yeah, for sure. The amount of olive things, so that's gonna get me, because you even have that in. That's what I mean. These images are stacking now for me, because there's the whole image of when Absalom is trying to take over Jerusalem, David has to leave and go across the Jordan, and it says he goes up, he ascends the Mount of Olives weeping, and he goes barefoot. And I'm always like, what is this? What's going on here? But it seems to be like it's probably connected to all that other imagery as well. It's really, I don't know. It's too much to chew on right now. I don't know what I'm doing. It's a lot. I do want to maybe we can come back to.
Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. Maybe we can come back to that passage. I can share with you a few other things that I've picked up on that one throughout the years. So
yeah, that'd be cool. And dig into the two witnesses as well. Another thing in Revelation that was earlier on in the garments of skin when we were talking about too, I'd like to revisit was the colors, all the gemstones, and then the colors of within the walls around Jerusalem, and the colors of the rainbow that surrounds God's throne. All this stuff is like, I'd like to hit that again, see what you guys think.
There's a lot there. There's certainly a lot there.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm right, but I think I'm on the right track. Let's just put it that way. But I do think there's a lot there. But yeah, this has been a lot of fun, guys. I've enjoyed this very much.
Yeah.
One of the most fun parts, I think, about meeting new people is kind of translating their worldview onto yours and getting to try their pants on a little bit. So it was really cool to hear more about the way you see things, Jed.
Yeah. I tend to look at. Yeah, I always want to find the farthest end of the envelope of how far I can push the thought. So like if I seem out there, it's only because I am.
Well,
But I think there's some sense to being out there too.
That's a good instinct.
So anyway, but yeah, guys, it was awesome. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. Maybe eventually we'll get to the chakras and seven heavens again at some point. Well, we'll get there. I don't know. It's too much, but all right. Well, yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks for doing this. I can send you the video too, Jed, and you can throw it on your channel if you want.
Yeah. I've been so slow on all that stuff on my end, like obviously kind of with the stuff I got going on.
Yeah.
But
all right. Well, yeah, it's no rush at all. I mean, just if you want it.
Okay.
So okay. But
yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. You guys both have a great night.
All right. You too. Take care.
All right. Talk to you soon. See ya.
Bye.